The dust from the morning stagecoach had barely settled on Main Street when the shouting began. Ruby Martinez pressed her face against the window of her small room above Murphy's Saloon, watching as a crowd gathered near the general store. The Arizona sun was already merciless at 8 in the morning, but the heat radiating from the angry voices below seemed even more intense. "She's been stealing from us for months," bellowed Harold Whitman, the store owner, his red face glistening with sweat as he waved a ledger in the air. "Food, supplies, even took medicine meant for my sick grandson." Ruby's stomach clenched as she recognized her name being shouted by the mob. She had hoped to slip out of town quietly this morning, to leave Copper Falls behind forever, but it seemed her past had caught up with her faster than she'd anticipated. "I seen her taking things when she thought nobody was looking," added Mrs. Eleanor Fitzgerald, the banker's wife, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being believed without question. "Always claimed she was buying on credit, but Harold's books tell a different story." The crowd murmured agreement, their faces hard with righteous anger. Ruby recognized most of them, people she'd served drinks to, people who'd smiled at her when they needed something, people who'd whispered behind their hands about the Mexican girl who worked at the saloon but never quite fit in anywhere else. Ruby grabbed her worn canvas bag and stuffed her few belongings inside. 3 dresses, a pair of boots, a photograph of her late mother, and the small amount of money she'd managed to save working 12-hour days, serving whiskey to cowboys and miners. It wasn't much to show for 23 years of life, but it was honest money, every penny of it. The sound of boots on the wooden stairs outside her door made her freeze. Heavy footsteps, deliberate and measured. She knew those footsteps. "Ruby?" Sheriff Jack Morrison's voice came through the thin door, calm but firm. "I need to speak with you." Ruby's hands trembled as she set down her bag. Jack Morrison was a fair man, one of the few people in Copper Falls who'd ever treated her with genuine respect, but even fair men had to uphold the law, and if the townspeople were calling for her arrest. She opened the door to find the sheriff standing in the narrow hallway, his weathered face serious but not unkind. At 45, Jack Morrison carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who'd seen enough of life to understand its complexities. His gray eyes met hers with something that looked almost like regret. "Sheriff Morrison," Ruby said, forcing her voice to remain steady, "I suppose you're here about the accusations." "I am." Jack removed his hat, running his fingers through his graying hair. "Harold Whitman filed formal charges this morning. Claims you've been stealing from his store for the better part of 6 months." Ruby's shoulders sagged. "And you believe him?" "I believe in evidence," Jack replied carefully. "And right now, Harold's got a ledger that shows a lot of missing inventory that coincides with times you were seen in his store." The unfairness of it hit Ruby like a physical blow. She'd worked harder than anyone in this town, sending most of her earnings to support her younger sister in Tucson while barely keeping herself fed. The idea that she'd risk everything by stealing was absurd, but she knew how it looked to people who'd already decided she didn't belong. "I never stole anything," Ruby said quietly. "I may not have much, Sheriff, but I have my integrity." Jack studied her face, and Ruby saw something flicker in his expression. Doubt, perhaps, or recognition of a truth that didn't match the accusations. But before he could respond, the sound of the crowd below grew louder and more agitated. "Morrison," Harold Whitman's voice boomed from the street. "You got her up there. We want justice." Jack moved to the window and looked down at the gathering crowd. Ruby joined him, her heart sinking as she saw at least 30 townspeople assembled, their faces twisted with anger and suspicion. Mrs. Fitzgerald was speaking animatedly to a group of women, no doubt spreading more poison about the saloon girl who thought she was too good for her station. "They want me arrested," Ruby observed, surprising herself with how calm she sounded. "They want someone to blame," Jack corrected. "This town's been struggling. The copper mine's barely producing, crops failed again this summer, and people are scared. When folks are scared and hurting, they look for someone to point fingers at. And the Mexican girl who works in a saloon makes an easy target." Jack was quiet for a moment, then turned to face her fully. "Ruby, I've known you for 3 years. You've never caused trouble, never given me reason to doubt your character. But I've got a job to do, and right now, the evidence." "I understand," Ruby interrupted, reaching for her bag. "You have to arrest me, actually," Jack said slowly. "I was thinking more along the lines of asking you some questions. Real questions, not the kind Harold Whitman wants me to ask." Ruby blinked in surprise. "What do you mean?" "I mean, Harold's ledger shows inventory missing, but it doesn't show how it went missing. Could be theft, could be poor bookkeeping, could be something else entirely." Jack's eyes were thoughtful. "And there's something about this whole situation that doesn't sit right with me." The crowd below was growing more restless, and Ruby could hear someone suggesting they didn't need to wait for the law to handle a common thief. The ugly word made her flinch. "Sheriff, maybe it would be better if I just left town," Ruby said. "I was planning to anyway. Let things settle down, find work somewhere else." "Running makes you look guilty," Jack pointed out. "And besides, if you didn't steal from Harold, then someone did. That person is still out there, and they might do it again." Ruby hadn't considered that possibility. In her mind, the accusations were just another example of how the town had never truly accepted her. But Jack was right. If someone was actually stealing from the general store, the real thief was letting her take the blame. "What kind of questions did you want to ask?" Ruby said finally. Jack smiled for the first time since he'd arrived, the kind that might get us both some answers. "But first, I need to go deal with that crowd before they decide to take matters into their own hands." He started toward the door, then paused. "Ruby, for what it's worth, I don't think you're a thief, and I'm going to prove it." As the sheriff's footsteps faded down the stairs, Ruby returned to the window and watched him emerge onto the street. The crowd surged forward, but Jack held up his hands for silence, his presence commanding enough to quiet even the angriest voices. "Folks," Jack's voice carried clearly in the desert air, "I understand your concerns, and I'm investigating the matter thoroughly, but we're going to do this by the book, with proper evidence and due process." "Due process for a thief," someone shouted from the back of the crowd. "Due process for everyone," Jack replied firmly. "That's what separates us from vigilantes and lynch mobs." Ruby felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the Arizona heat. For the first time in months, someone was standing up for her, not because they owed her anything, but because it was right. But as she watched the crowd reluctantly disperse, their angry mutters echoing off the buildings, Ruby couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Whatever was really happening in Copper Falls, whoever was truly responsible for the thefts, she was caught in the middle of something bigger than simple accusations. The desert wind picked up, rattling the windows and carrying with it the scent of sage and secrets. In a town where survival often mattered more than truth, Ruby Martinez was about to discover that sometimes the most unexpected allies could emerge from the most unlikely places, and sometimes the real thief was hiding in plain sight. Sheriff Morrison spent the better part of the morning at Harold Whitman's general store, examining the ledger that supposedly proved Ruby's guilt. The shop was cramped and cluttered, with shelves reaching to the ceiling and merchandise stacked in every available corner. The air smelled of coffee beans, leather, and the peculiar mustiness that seemed to cling to everything in the desert. "See here," Harold pointed to entries in his spidery handwriting, his thick fingers stabbing at the pages. "Food items, medicine, even some fabric. All missing on days when that girl was in my store. Can't be coincidence." Jack studied the ledger carefully, noting the dates and items. Harold's bookkeeping was meticulous, almost obsessively so. Every penny accounted for, every transaction recorded in precise detail. It was exactly the kind of evidence that would convince a jury, which made Jack even more suspicious. "Harold, this is impressive record keeping," Jack said slowly. "When did you start being this thorough with your inventory?" Harold's face flushed slightly. "A man's got to protect his business, especially in times like these. Started keeping better track about, 6 months ago. Right around the time the theft supposedly started. That's why I started keeping better records," Harold snapped. "I knew something was wrong, so I started paying closer attention." Jack nodded thoughtfully, then closed the ledger. "I'll need to keep this for evidence." And I'll need a list of everyone who has access to your store. Access? Harold laughed bitterly. Sheriff, this isn't some bank vault. People come and go during business hours. Hell, half the town's been in here in the past week. I mean after hours. Harold, who has keys? Who knows where you keep your spare? Who helps you with inventory? Harold's expression grew guarded. Just me and my son, Billy. And Mrs. Cartwright comes in twice a week to help with the books. Jack made notes in his small notebook. Mrs. Cartwright being the banker's wife's sister. That's right. Eleanor vouched for her. Said she was good with numbers. Jack had been hoping Harold wouldn't mention Mrs. Cartwright. The woman was Eleanor Fitzgerald's sister, which connected her directly to one of Ruby's most vocal accusers. It wasn't proof of anything, but it was the kind of connection that made an experienced lawman pause and think. After leaving the general store, Jack walked the short distance to Murphy's Saloon. The establishment was closed during the day, but he knew Ruby would be there, probably cleaning glasses or sweeping floors to keep herself busy. He found her behind the bar, methodically polishing whiskey bottles with a cloth that had seen better days. "How are you holding up?" Jack asked, settling onto one of the bar stools. Ruby looked up, her dark eyes tired but determined. "I've been better. Mrs. Patterson from the boarding house came by to tell me I'm no longer welcome there. Apparently, harboring a thief is bad for her reputation." Jack frowned. "Where are you planning to stay?" "Mr. Murphy said I could keep my room here for now," but Ruby shrugged. "I can't hide upstairs forever. This town's made up its mind about me. Maybe. Or maybe someone's worked very hard to make sure the town thinks exactly what they want. It to think." Ruby paused in her polishing. "What do you mean?" Jack pulled out his notebook and flipped through the pages. "I've been thinking about the timing of all this. Harold says he started keeping detailed records 6 months ago because he suspected theft. But Ruby, you've been working here for 3 years. If you were going to steal from him, why start 6 months ago?" "I wouldn't steal from him at all," Ruby said firmly. "I know that. But let's follow the logic. 6 months ago, what changed in your life? Anything different? New expenses? New pressures?" Ruby considered the question carefully. "Well, my sister Maria had her baby. I started sending her a little extra money to help with expenses. But that came from working extra shifts here, not from stealing. Can you prove that? Letters from your sister. Receipts for money orders. I have some letters," Ruby said slowly. "And I always sent money through the Western Union office. Mr. Peterson keeps records." Jack made another note. "What else changed 6 months ago? Anyone new in town? Any changes in your routine?" Ruby thought for a moment, then her eyes widened. "Slightly. Mrs. Cartwright started helping Harold with his books. Before that, he did everything himself, and his records were, well, let's just say they weren't as organized. Interesting." Jack tapped his pencil against his notebook. "Ruby, I want you to think carefully. In the past 6 months, have you noticed anything strange about the way people treat you? Anyone asking unusual questions about your schedule, where you go, what you buy?" Actually, Ruby hesitated, then continued. "Mrs. Fitzgerald has been unusually friendly lately. Started coming into the saloon for lunch sometimes, which she never did before. Always asking about my plans, whether I was thinking of leaving town, that sort of thing. And you found that strange, very strange. The banker's wife doesn't usually concern herself with saloon girls. I thought maybe she was just being Christian charitable. But it always felt calculated." Jack was beginning to see the outline of something that made him very uncomfortable. Eleanor Fitzgerald was one of the town's most influential women, married to the man who controlled most of the money in Copper Falls. Her sister, Mrs. Cartwright, had access to Harold's store and his records, and now Eleanor was leading the charge against Ruby, demanding justice for crimes that were suspiciously well documented. "Ruby, I need you to stay close for the next day or two. Don't leave town, but also don't go anywhere alone. I have a feeling this situation is more complicated than it appears. You think someone's setting me up. I think someone's been very clever about creating a believable case against you. The question is why." Jack stood to leave, then turned back. "One more thing. Has anyone ever asked you about your plans to leave town, specifically whether You were planning to stay permanently or move on. Ruby's face went pale. Mrs. Fitzgerald asked me that just last week. She seemed very interested in whether I had family elsewhere, whether I was planning to settle down here or keep moving. And what did you tell her? The truth. That I was saving money to join my sister in Tucson. That I never intended to stay in Copper Falls permanently. Jack felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to align in his mind, forming a picture that was both clearer and more disturbing than he'd expected. Ruby, I think you're not the target of this scheme. You're the scapegoat. Someone needed a convenient thief. Someone who wouldn't be around long enough to defend herself properly. But why? What's the point of framing me for theft? That, Jack said grimly, is what I intend to find out. But I have a suspicion it has less to do with stolen merchandise and more to do with covering up something much bigger. As Jack left the saloon, his mind was already working through the implications of what he'd discovered. In his experience, elaborate deceptions like this one were usually designed to hide crimes far more serious than petty theft. Someone in Copper Falls was using Ruby Martinez as a distraction, and Jack Morrison was determined to find out who and why. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as he walked toward the bank, his boots echoing on the wooden sidewalk. It was time to have a conversation with Mr. and Mrs. Fitzgerald about their sudden interest in the welfare of a saloon girl they'd barely acknowledged for 3 years. Behind him, Ruby watched from the saloon window, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and hope. For the first time since the accusations began, someone believed her story. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the truth Jack was uncovering might be more dangerous than the lies she'd been accused of. That evening, Jack Morrison sat in his small office behind the jail, surrounded by ledgers, bank records, and a growing pile of evidence that painted a very different picture than the one Harold Whitman had presented. The oil lamp cast dancing shadows on the papers spread across his desk, and the Arizona night air carried the distant sound of piano music from Murphy's Saloon. A soft knock at his door interrupted his concentration. "Comin'," he called, not looking up from the bank statements he'd been studying. To his surprise, Ruby Martinez stepped into the office, carrying a small wooden box and wearing a determined expression that reminded Jack of how she'd looked when she first arrived in town 3 years ago, young, proud, and refusing to be intimidated. "I brought something you might want to see," Ruby said, setting the box on Jack's desk. "Letters from my sister, receipts from Western Union, and records of every penny I've sent to Tucson in the past year." Jack opened the box and examined the contents. The letters were written in Spanish, but Ruby translated the relevant passages. Expressions of gratitude for money received, updates on the baby's health, and plans for Ruby to eventually join the family in Tucson. The Western Union receipts were equally damning to the theft theory, showing regular money transfers that accounted for most of Ruby's earnings. "This proves you've been sending money to your sister, just like you said," Jack observed, "but more importantly, it shows you barely had enough left over to buy necessities for yourself, let alone stockpile stolen goods." "There's something else," Ruby said quietly. "I've been thinking about what you said, about someone asking questions about my plans. It wasn't just Mrs. Fitzgerald." Jack looked up from the receipts. "Who else?" "Her husband. Mr. Fitzgerald came to the saloon about a month ago, which was strange because he never drinks and certainly never socializes with the help. He bought a bottle of whiskey, said it was for a client, but he spent most of the time asking me about my family, my background, whether I had any intention of settling down permanently in Copper Falls. Did he seem interested in any particular aspect of your situation?" Ruby hesitated, then continued. "He asked very specific questions about my sister's situation in Tucson, whether she was married, whether her husband had steady work, whether they owned property. At the time, I thought he was just making conversation, but now it sounds like he was conducting an investigation." Jack made notes as Ruby spoke. "Anyone else show unusual interest in your personal affairs?" "Mrs. Cartwright. She started coming into the store when I was there, always very friendly, always asking about my shopping habits. She'd make comments about how I seemed to buy a lot of food for one person, or how I always seemed to know exactly what I needed without browsing. Jack felt another piece of the puzzle click into place. Ruby, did Mrs. Cartwright ever suggest specific items you might want to purchase? Or recommend particular brands or products? Actually, yes, she was always suggesting I try this or that, especially medicines and expensive items. She'd say things like, "Oh, you really should try this new tonic," or "This fabric would look lovely on you." I always told her I couldn't afford such things, but she'd insist they were worth the investment, and Harold would note your interest in those items in his ledger. I suppose so. I never thought about it that way. Jack leaned back in his chair, the full scope of the deception becoming clear. Ruby, I think you've been the target of a very sophisticated frame job. Someone has been systematically building a case against you for months, documenting your presence in the store, creating a pattern that looks like theft when viewed from the outside. But why? What's the point? Before Jack could answer, the sound of hurried footsteps on the wooden sidewalk outside caught his attention. A moment later, young Billy Whitman burst through the door, his face flushed and his eyes wide with panic. "Sheriff Morrison," the boy gasped, "you've got to come. Quick, my store. Someone broke in." Jack grabbed his hat and gun belt. "When, Billy?" "Just now. I was walking home from the Hendersons' place when I saw the back door standing open. When I went to check, half the shelves were empty." Ruby stood up, her face pale. "They'll blame me for this too." "Not if I can help it," Jack said grimly. "Billy, who else knows about the break-in?" "Nobody yet. I came straight here." "Good boy. Ruby, you're coming with me. I want witnesses to see exactly where you are and what you're doing." The three of them hurried through the dark streets toward Whitman's general store. Jack's mind was racing, trying to piece together the timing of events. Someone had broken into the store tonight, just hours after he'd begun questioning the original theft accusations. It was either an incredible coincidence or a desperate attempt to muddy the waters. They found the store's back door standing wide open, just as Billy had described. Jack lit a lantern and surveyed the scene carefully. The break-in was clumsy, obvious. Whoever had done this wanted it to be discovered quickly. "Sheriff," Ruby said quietly, "this doesn't make sense." "What do you mean?" "If someone wanted to rob the store, why would they leave the door open? And look at what's missing. It's all the same kinds of items I was accused of stealing. Food, medicine, fabric. But they left the cash box untouched." Jack examined the cash box, which sat openly on the counter with several dollars still inside. "You're right. This wasn't a robbery. It was theater." "Theater for whose benefit?" Billy asked, confused. "For mine," Jack realized. "Someone wanted to make it look like the real thief struck again while Ruby was with me. But they made a mistake." Jack walked to the front of the store and examined the lock on the main door. It was secure, undamaged. He then moved to the back door, studying the frame and lock mechanism carefully. "Billy, does your father usually lock both doors at night?" "Always. Front and back, every night for as long as I can remember." "Then whoever did this had a key to the back door." "The lock wasn't forced. It was opened properly and then left standing open to make it look like a break-in." Ruby's eyes widened. "How many people have keys to the store?" "According to your father," Jack said to Billy, "only family members and Mrs. Cartwright." Billy frowned. "But Mrs. Cartwright was at the church social tonight. I saw her there myself, talking to Mrs. Fitzgerald and that new family from Phoenix." "What time did you see her?" "Must have been around 8 o'clock. The social didn't end until after 9. Jack checked his pocket watch. It was now nearly 10:30. "Billy, I need you to do something very important. I want you to go to the church and verify that Mrs. Cartwright was still there when the social ended. Ask specific people when they last saw her." As Billy hurried off into the night, Jack turned to Ruby. "I think we're about to solve 2 mysteries at once. Who's been stealing from Harold's store, and who's been framing you for it? But if Mrs. Cartwright was at the church social, then someone else used her key. Someone who had access to it and knew the store well enough to take exactly the right items to reinforce the pattern of theft that's been building against you." Ruby stared at the ransacked shelves, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Someone who's been planning merchandise." "But why?" Harold asked, his voice barely a whisper. Daniel, if you needed money, you could have asked for a loan. A loan? Daniel laughed bitterly. From what bank, Harold? I am the bank, and I'm ruining it. The mining investments, the drought-affecting crop loans, the railroad deciding to bypass our town. Everything's falling apart. I needed time to figure out how to fix it. And I needed someone to blame for the irregularities that people might start noticing. Eleanor Fitzgerald sank into a chair, her face crumbling as the full scope of her husband's scheme became clear. Danny, what have you done? I did what I had to do to protect our family, our position in this community, Daniel said desperately. Ruby was supposed to leave town after being accused. She was supposed to disappear, and everyone would assume she was guilty. Nobody was supposed to get hurt. Nobody except an innocent young woman whose life you were willing to destroy. Ruby said quietly. It was the first time she'd spoken since they'd entered the bank, and her voice carried a dignity that made Daniel flinch. Jack stepped forward and placed Daniel Fitzgerald under arrest for embezzlement and conspiracy to commit fraud. Mrs. Cartwright was arrested as an accessory, while Eleanor, though not charged, would face social and financial ruin as the truth spread through the community. Later that afternoon, Jack stood with Ruby on the steps of the general store as Harold publicly apologized for his accusations. The crowd that had gathered to demand her arrest just days before now murmured embarrassedly, many unable to meet her eyes. Miss Martinez, Harold said, his voice carrying across the street. I owe you more than an apology. I owe you justice, and I've failed to provide it. Your reputation has been damaged by my willingness to believe the worst without seeking the truth. Ruby nodded graciously, though Jack could see the hurt still fresh in her eyes. Mr. Whitman, I appreciate your words, but apologies don't erase the damage that's been done. No. Harold agreed, they don't. But perhaps actions can begin to repair it. He turned to address the crowd. Miss Martinez has been wronged by this community, and I intend to make amends. I'm offering her a position as my store manager, with a salary that reflects her true worth and my regret for what she's endured. The offer surprised everyone, including Ruby. It was generous beyond anything she might have expected, and it represented something more valuable than money, acceptance, and respect from a community that had rejected her. That's very kind of you, Mr. Whitman, Ruby said carefully, but I'm not sure Copper Falls is the right place for me anymore. Jack had been expecting this response. The damage done to Ruby's sense of belonging couldn't be easily repaired, no matter how generous the gestures of atonement. Ruby, Jack said quietly, I understand why you'd want to leave, but running away won't change what happened here, and staying might prevent it from happening to someone else. Ruby looked at him, then at the faces in the crowd, some ashamed, some curious, some genuinely remorseful. What do you mean? I mean, this town learned something important these past few days. We learned that jumping to conclusions based on prejudice and fear can destroy innocent lives. We learned that real justice requires courage and patience, and the willingness to look beyond easy answers. Jack's voice grew stronger. If you stay, if you take Harold's offer and make a life here, you become a reminder of those lessons. You become proof that people can change, that communities can do better. The crowd waited silently for Ruby's response. In that moment, the future of Copper Falls, its capacity for growth, tolerance, and redemption, seemed to hang on the decision of one young woman who had every right to turn her back on them all. Ruby Martinez looked around at the faces surrounding her, seeing for the first time not just suspicion and judgment, but genuine hope for forgiveness and the possibility of something better. Mr. Whitman, she said finally, I'll accept your offer on one condition. Name it. I want to hire Mrs. Cartwright when she gets out of jail. People make mistakes, and they deserve second chances to prove they can do better. The murmur of surprise that rippled through the crowd spoke to how completely Ruby had transformed the conversation from one of justice and punishment to one of mercy and redemption. 6 months later, Ruby Martinez managed the most successful general store in 3 counties, serving customers who had learned to value fairness over prejudice and courage over convenience. Sheriff Jack Morrison had successfully prosecuted the embezzlement case and implemented new procedures to prevent similar corruption in the future. And Daniel Fitzgerald, serving his sentence in the territorial prison, wrote regular letters of apology to Ruby, letters she read carefully and sometimes answered, believing that redemption was possible for anyone willing to acknowledge their mistakes and work to make amends. The desert wind still blew through Copper Falls, but now it carried with it the scent of second chances and the hard-won knowledge that justice delayed was not always justice denied. Sometimes it was justice made stronger by the courage of those who refused to accept easy answers in place of difficult truths. In the end, the townsfolk had claimed the saloon girl was a thief, but what the sheriff returned to them was something far more valuable than stolen merchandise. He returned their capacity for justice, their willingness to look beyond surface appearances, and their understanding that true strength comes not from finding someone to blame, but from having the courage to admit when they've been wrong. Ruby Martinez had come to Copper Falls as a young woman seeking honest work and a fresh start. She had nearly left as a scapegoat for other people's crimes and prejudices. Instead, she stayed as a symbol of what the town could become when it chose wisdom over fear, compassion over judgment, and truth over convenient lies. The general store thrived under her management, becoming not just a place of commerce, but a gathering point where the community continued to learn the lessons that Ruby's courage had taught them. And every evening, as the desert sun set over the Arizona landscape, the people of Copper Falls were reminded that sometimes the most valuable things we can possess are not the material goods we accumulate, but the integrity we maintain and the justice we're willing to fight for, especially when it's difficult. Sheriff Jack Morrison kept the original accusation papers in his desk drawer, not as evidence of a closed case, but as a reminder that the badge he wore carried with it the responsibility to seek truth rather than simply maintain order. And Ruby Martinez kept the key to her room above Murphy's Saloon, not because she lived there anymore, but because it reminded her that home isn't just a place you're born into. Sometimes it's a place you earn through perseverance, grace, and the courage to forgive even when forgiveness isn't easy. The saloon girl who was once accused of stealing had given the town of Copper Falls something it desperately needed, a chance to steal a glimpse of who they could become when they chose to be better than their fears and bigger than their prejudices. And in return, they had given her something equally precious, proof that people can change, communities can grow, and justice, when it finally arrives, can heal even the deepest wounds.